Hello, how's everybody doing? Yeah, wait, come on. Yes? Doing well? Okay. I'm here to tell you, like many speakers here, about the future. But this is a very specific future. It's actually a future about me. It's kind of important to me. But I'm also talking about a future that actually relates to each of us as individuals. And I am a journalist, I'm a reporter, and I've spent many, many years covering a lot of the wonderful things that Daniel was just talking about, writing these stories about this discovery, that discovery. And a few years back, I got a little frustrated about what is going on with all this new technology. You know, when is it coming? When is it going to be available for us, right? I mean, and Daniel, I always love following Daniel. He's a friend, and he gives a great kind of introduction into what I talk about, which is essentially a user perspective. And so what I did was I went out and I did something called the Experimental Man Project. I went out and I literally took every test I could possibly take. And I wrote a book about it, and there's a great website. In fact, I'm going to be going really quickly here, so I do encourage you to look at experimentalman.com for a lot more information, unless you want to just go out and grab the book. Anyway, I'm going to start by, you all have been sitting here very patiently this morning, and it's already been an amazing morning. And I'm going to ask you to participate here for just a second, if that's okay. At least one person is okay with that. Okay, how many of you have had a genetic test? You don't have to answer this, by the way, if you don't feel comfortable. Okay, a few people, scattering of people. How many want to? We'll see if you still do after this talk. Have you had an MRI brain scan of your brain? Anybody? Okay, a few people, okay. It's essentially a machine reading your thoughts. Have you checked your chemical body burden? Does anybody even know what this is? Okay, this is something you'll be hearing about coming down the line here. This is the amount of trace chemicals in your body, things that get inside there. It's pesticides, it's mercury, it's that sort of thing. So anybody? Anybody had that test? Okay, I guess I'm the only one. And then this is the big question, and I throw this in because I'm not only a journalist, I also have a little program at Berkeley called the Center for Life Science Policy. And I actually, the sweet spot that I like to report about, to think about, is really where all this is headed. Where are all these great discoveries going? Also how we implement them, which I'll get to in a second. But how long do you want to live? It's a pretty simple question. And I'm going to give you 3 possible answers here just to make it easier. So we have 80, which is the normal lifespan today in America, roughly, the average lifespan. 120 years old, which is about as long as any human has ever lived, and 150 years old. So we'll take those away, and you can only vote once here. How many people want to live to be 80? And if you're already 80, go ahead and raise your hand. How many people want to live to be 120? And you people who are 80, you can vote again. Okay, got a scattering here. How about 150? I got a few people. When I'm out home in San Francisco near Silicon Valley, you get everybody raising their hand. Okay, we're talking about something called the age of personalized health. And Daniel mentioned a little bit about this. You may have heard of personalized medicine. And I use the term personalized health because it's really everything. It's trying to stay healthy as well as being treated with medications and other treatments once you get sick. But it's all about being personalized. Because in the past, this is from the Middle Ages, it could actually even be today, mostly what you get is treatment of sickness. And you get essentially one-size-fits-all kind of medicine. A doctor, you come into the hospital, they try to figure out what's wrong with you based on large population studies, and they try to fit you into that. What we're talking about, this is my family, and it could be yours. We're talking about a future here, and hopefully a present that's merging into that future, where we really try to keep people healthy. And it's all about wellness. Now, unfortunately, people will get sick eventually, but this is an idea of trying to head that off to try to mitigate illness as much as we possibly can, and also the personalized aspect. So the experiment. The Experimental Man Project. I'm going to give you just a brief overview of all the crazy, sort of weird experiments I did. It was about 250 labs and research centers, and I'm still going. I'm going to show you at the end a couple of experiments. Even after the project really finished, I still occasionally get something really exciting and go ahead and do it. I gave up over 3 liters of blood, not at the same time. 11,000 genotypes annotated, and for those of you who are geneticists, you know what that is, but basically it's 11,000 traits that have been identified using all of the data that's been collected over the last several years. Everything from the fact that I have blue eyes, which actually was not news to me, I could look in the mirror and see that, to various risk factors for diseases. Hundreds of environmental toxins, that body burden study I talked about. I spent 22 hours plus in an MRI scanner. And those of you who have been in MRI scanners doing research, you know how boring those 22 hours were. The cost of this is interesting, and I don't have time to get into this, but of course that's a major part of what we're talking about here. When I finished most of these experiments in 2008, the cost of it was around $150,000. And I'll be giving you details of the tests here, and you can see where that cost would have come from. Most of that was sequencing costs, genetic sequencing, some of the other molecular tests I took. These are advanced, mostly prototypes, and it's clearly not ready for prime time, although it is interesting that that price today would be about a third, about $50,000. Especially genetic sequencing costs have gone from millions of dollars down to around $5,000 for a complete genomic sequence. So clearly that's heading in the right direction, but you're not going to be getting Medicare, Medicaid, and Aetna and various insurance companies paying $50,000 for these tests anytime soon. I started to get a baseline for the test with my own family physician. And he's a really great guy, University of California at San Francisco, named Josh Adler. And he kind of looks like this. Actually, he's better looking. But he gave me, in my 12-minute exam, which state-of-the-art today for a healthy person, what can you find out about your future? And basically, I'm healthy. I got a few scores, like cholesterol score, that kind of thing. And I actually knew that going in, that I at least felt healthy. And I was happy to get his seal of approval. But that's essentially where we are today for most people that walk in just for a typical exam. You get the typical tests. Now we're going to move into the exam of the future. And this is divided into 4 sections. It's genes, environment, brain, and body. And those are actually the 4 sections of the book as well. So genes, chapter 1, 11,399 traits. As I said, more than 11,000. We have a program actually online, which you can link up to through the site. It keeps track of all the new genes that are discovered, all the new studies coming in, and it just adds my information to that. So every time I look at this, the number goes up. And I do have to tell you, as a user, as a kind of consumer report situation here, this hasn't really changed my life because much of this science is still very new, very preliminary. And in fact, almost all of these studies are still those population studies. They're really telling me where I fit in, as a white male of a certain age. And it doesn't give me that much specific information about myself, although that's changing. So just to give you a quick sampling here, I have a 15% increased risk of having a brain aneurysm. Now 15%, by the way, this is on top of the average risk that you already have. So it's not just a 15%, it's on top of whatever the average would be. And that, if a physician or someone looks at that, they'll say, that's almost a negligible increase in risk. And when you get the information, and this is a picture of me with my 23andMe kit, Daniel just told you about that, spitting in a container. You spit in there, you send it in, they send you back your results, they break open that saliva and that your DNA is in there and they test it. You get something like this though, and depending on how you feel about, basically how paranoid you are about your health, this could scare you, might not. Interesting ethical situation. Melanoma, I have just the average risk, no increased risk. Alzheimer's, thankfully, I have a low risk compared to the average. Heart attack is interesting. I have a high, medium, and low risk. How can that be? It's because 3 of the companies that tested me have different ways of figuring out, basically from the same data, what your risk is for something rather serious, heart attack. And I don't have time to get into detail why that is, but it does in that Consumer Reports sense tell you if you compare and contrast, there still needs to be some work done here if I'm getting contradictory results like this. Empathy, I seem to have slightly less empathy, so I don't really care what you think. Memory, though, I can remember that I didn't care. And then the only one on this list that I actually do take seriously, and one should take seriously, is warfarin sensitivity. Warfarin is a blood thinner. It's used post-surgery, in emergency situations. Usually you aren't around to tell people that you have this particular genetic variation. And this makes you, as it suggests, sensitive to this particular drug, which actually can give you great harm or even kill you if I'm given the normal dose, according to this. And it's not an FDA-approved indication, but the FDA has suggested that physicians use this test to avoid bad side effects. My favorite genetic marker, I'm going to walk over here to the podium, take a sip of coffee. It's the caffeine fast metabolizer gene. Now, how many of you can drink coffee right before you go to bed and you don't feel it? Okay, it's about right. It should be about 25% of you. So we are the lucky ones if we love coffee. My poor friends who have to stop drinking at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, I just keep going. Not a particularly medically relevant gene, but it's an interesting one. Chapter 2 is the environment. We've added a few things to our environment over time as humans. And I'm going to run through this, by the way, fairly quickly. And again, I do encourage you. Part of what you get as the human guinea pig is an enormous dump of data. And trying to sort through it is an interesting question unto its own. I have 50% higher than the mean, the national mean from the Centers of Disease Control for DDT. And this is because I grew up in Kansas and was one of those kids, not only were they spraying the fields around where I live, but we were riding our bikes through the cloud of DDT when they sprayed for mosquitoes every year. And this comes, by the way, from a National Geographic story called The Pollution Within. And they sent me back at National Geographic to find out where I might have been exposed to these different toxins once I'd been tested. So I did go back home and it was kind of interesting. I knew where that came from, though, the DDT. PCBs, I have a slightly elevated level of that. Phthalates, which are plastic ingredients, or ingredients that are put into plastic that make sunglasses flexible. They also, when you add a scent like mint or lavender to your shampoo, that's a phthalate. And I had the test taken, the blood drawn for this test, about an hour after I shampooed my hair. So that's why I had such a high level, 200%. If I'd taken it that afternoon, I probably would have had 0, because phthalates only stay in your body. Each of these chemicals stay in your body a certain amount of time. Phthalates only a few hours. And by the way, these all, at the levels I'm talking about, parts per trillion, parts per billion, there's really no evidence that there's great harm here, but there's also no evidence that over time these chemicals don't cause you harm. And I don't want to scare people, but you all probably have very similar profiles. Flame retardants, 1,200%, 12 times the mean. And the only thing we can figure is that I fly a lot, and flame retardants are obviously all over this room. We have them by law, because if this room, heaven forbid, started on fire, we'd want to have that fire suppressed while we got out. It looks like I maybe have this high amount because I fly so much, and planes are drenched in flame retardants. Again, these are not levels that alarm experts, although 1,200%. And then finally, mercury. I was tested for a lot of heavy metals. I did a before and after on this, and the main source of mercury for humans is fish, big fish. And I do encourage you to eat fish, but maybe small fish. Mercury gets into the food chain, and the predators eat the little fish, and it gets up into things like swordfish and marlin, big fish. So I did a before blood test, before I ate 2 meals of fish, big fish, swordfish and a halibut. Halibut for lunch, swordfish for dinner. 400, well, it's basically 4 times the EPA suggested standard, although when I ran the test, it was actually slightly below the EPA standard. They've just changed it. So I was okay, now I'm not. But after the meal, I had spiked up to almost 1,300 times the amount, so 13 times, 1,300%. And so just from that one meal, I almost tripled my onboard level of mercury. Now, the good news about mercury is it does dissipate for most people pretty quickly in about 20 or 30 days. But the next slide here shows you what I began to do as I took these tests. I began to combine things. And we get into envirogenomics, and these are actually some risk factors for my sensitivity to mercury. And you can see I have a slight risk factor with that little red C there. Brain, I was tested for Alzheimer's, which, again, I had no trace. This is a different technology than the genetics. Greed, which I had a normal risk factor for. Risk-taking. I was told I have it adverse. I'm adverse to risk-taking. Hello, experimental man. Memory, I had the memory of a 25-year-old the first time I took this test, and they said, well, you should take it 3 times just to make sure. I said, I don't want to take it again. Political belief, okay, I'm sorry, I know we're in a mostly Republican state here, but there is a test that can tell you 100% accuracy if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Now think about that, as a club that you might want to join or not join if they want to test you to make sure you're really one of us. All right, one of my brain tests was for anxiety. And I went into the scanner, they showed me a roaring lion, but just for a second, it was subliminal. I didn't even see it consciously, but my brain did. And this is what happened. Basically, this is the centers of the brain that light up. It's the fight or flight, really old systems that tell you, oh my God, there's a lion, I gotta get the heck out of here, or maybe fight it. And they call that emotional incongruence. They then showed me a field of daisies. It's very calm. And the idea here was to see what my brain did. Did it basically settle down? Because it was all fired up here. And in fact, it did. And that meant that I have a normal sense of anxiety as opposed to having an anxiety disorder, which was nice news. Another brain test I took was I was given a series of products, and I was told to rate them 1 to 8. And the first one I was shown was a movie poster for Pan's Labyrinth. Now, this is a really dark, violent art movie. And because I'm sometime filmmaker, I gave it an 8, because I'm a film kind of guy. Unfortunately, my brain did not agree with me. My brain loved Dodgeball, the movie. Maybe that 14-year-old boy, really is still there. These are some of my results. You can see Dodgeball. Fortunately, The Kite Runner was second. So it was kind of an intellectual book. But then Dreamgirls is third. Anyway, not that I didn't like Dreamgirls. Apparently, my brain liked it even more than I did. So let's sum this up in the body. And this is where it all comes together. And a lot of biomedical research and science, in fact, even a lot of medicine, is all separated into these silos and into different sections. You might be treated, obviously with a neurologist with your brain and other specialists. But for us, we want to know what's going on in the whole body. So this was a test, an experiment that we ran, tying together a lot of these factors. And it's around heart attack, so my heart attack risk. And I don't have, by the way, heart disease in my family, thankfully. So I was coming into this with that personal knowledge. But we added genomics. This is a big algorithm we added all this data into. We added genomics, various biomarkers. These are familiar tests like cholesterol and other lipids, ultrasound and CT to see if my heart was healthy. And we combined them all and compared them to this biosimulation, a very sophisticated program, a company called Intellos, and they predicted my future. There it is. Wish I had a drum roll. So what you see here, I don't have a pointer, but that yellow line, this is basically giving me 3 choices for my future over 20 years. So that yellow line is if I gain a very small amount of weight each year. It's about a half a pound a year. And that's a 70% risk factor for heart attack. Now this was a surprise coming from a guy whose family, we don't have heart disease in the family. So that was a little alarming. But then the green line down there tells me that if I keep a stable weight, I have a 2% risk factor for heart attack. The line even below that is statins, cholesterol-lowering drugs, which gives me a 0%. So this is really what the future is all about. Now, I don't know if this is accurate or not because it's very early. There's actually no other algorithm that I can compare this to see if I get the same results. Remember the conflicting results earlier from the different companies. But this is really where the future of personalized health is going. And we'll have choices like this. And then the question is, what do we do with them? And I went to see a nutritionist. You see that hamburger there? That's how much fat is in a hamburger. Those 3 vials of fat. But I went to see a nutritionist, and I said, I had this kind of alarming possibility. And, as a man over 40, we tend to gain a pound or so a year anyway, and I was on that trajectory. So it's a big issue, by the way, with all of this personalized medicine, is about will people actually alter their behavior? So the future of all this, we will one day have, let me pull out my iPhone here, we'll have something like this. Those of you who have iPhones or Blackberries, it'll be called an iHealth. And if anybody from Apple is in the audience, you can go ahead and steal this. You can see I've set the date to 5 years in the future from today. And this will be the kind of device, and Daniel gave you an overview of some of the things feeding into this. It's the kind of device that will allow us to make certain decisions. So I talked to you about my little experiment with mercury. I will be able to feed in various data and come up with, should I eat that halibut sandwich? I happen to live in San Francisco, and maybe you all didn't notice that the San Francisco Giants actually won the World Series. But go to a Giants game, hot dog plus beer plus my profile, it's probably high risk. Anyway, in this talk here, the anxiety level, I do have anxiety disorder, by the way, that runs through my mother's family. And when I was younger, I would get quite anxious about giving a speech like this, but I've learned to modulate my behavior, so I guess I get a safe reading there. Anyway, more experiments, and I will wind up here. Daniel talked to you about IPS cells, induced pluripotent stem cells, and thankfully he explained it so I don't have to. But basically, I sent in some blood to a lab up in Wisconsin. They reversed my white blood cells back to an embryonic-like state, the cells that occurred right after conception, which grew into all of the cells in my body. So that is actually my own personal cell line. And this right here is the heart cells that they grew from those induced pluripotent stem cells. I'm out of time here, and I would like to say that if you want more information here, it's experimentalman.com. My own website is DavidEwingDuncan.com, and you can find out a lot more information about this. I also have something called the Personalized Health Manifesto, which I'm going to leave copies of in the back. And this is in more of my academic work. And this is telling us how we might be able to accelerate getting some of these things that I'm talking about and really getting over some of these ethical issues and some of the issues in making this happen. So thank you very much.